Welcome to Wellness with John, practical advice to help you thrive. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been in practice for 25 years, providing mindfulness based cognitive therapy to thousands of patients. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about how chronic pain causes chronic and complicated grief. Stay tuned. So, in today's video, I'm going to talk about the psychological effects of chronic pain. And in particular, I'm going to talk about how sufferers of chronic pain experience a complicated grief process. So, I'm going to start by just explaining what grief is, what complicated grief is, and why chronic pain causes complicated grief. And then I'll give you a bonus tip at the end that is one of many effective techniques to help with complicated grief. All right, so stay tuned. So, to begin with, I want to talk about grief. Grief is the psychological response to a change or a loss. And grief doesn't only happen when a pet or a loved one dies. We think about that as a conventional idea about grief, that we're grieving a loss of a person after death. But grief is actually the psychological, mental, and emotional kinds of responses and ways of working through a change or a loss. And any change can cause the grief reaction. Any sort of loss can cause the grief reaction. So sometimes people are a little surprised when they have a grief reaction after, let's say, selling a house and moving to a new geographical location, right? Or even a positive change. People can actually have a grief reaction after getting married, So grief is when we feel emotions in response to a change or loss. And when that change or that loss affects us psychologically, meaning that how we think about ourselves, how we think about our world, how we relate to the thing that changed or that we lost, and how we relate to life after the change and loss, if all of that is significant enough for it to be even prominent enough for us to notice it, but often, it's more prominent than that because it actually is compelling. It takes our attention and it may even get in the way and be troubling in many ways, right? So that's kind of grief 101. But another thing that's important to understand about grief is that grief does not happen in neat, tidy, discrete, sequential stages. And I made another video on this channel about explaining how grief doesn't happen in stages, and I'll put a link for that up here if you want to go watch that after you watch this video. But basically, the old school idea was that, we had denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And the idea was that grief happened in these neat stages. But, the reality is it doesn't actually happen that way. The way we think about grief today is that there are certain tasks that we accomplish through the grief process. And there are separate tasks, but they're not sequential. So you don't do task one and then proceed to task two. And you're not limited from doing task two if you haven't finished task one, right? That's the old school model. The newer model is basically that there are different types of tasks related to grief, and we are often accomplishing more than one of those tasks simultaneously. So they're not sequential. And they're also more open. So rather than having, in the old school model, a stage of anger, right? And so that means that, yes, if I'm feeling a lot of anger, I must be in that stage. And if I'm in that stage, it must only be anger and not a mix of a bunch of other things. In terms of the task model, it just says you're going to be able to feel emotions in response to the change or loss, right? So it doesn't limit it to a monochrome anger or depression or sadness or something like that, right? So the tasks of grief include being able to acknowledge the loss. So you're actually not necessarily accepting, oh, this is fine, but you are able to acknowledge this is what I'm dealing with, and that you're able to have feelings related to that loss, feelings that are congruent and proportionate, and that you're able to feel them constructively so that they don't overwhelm you and, induce let's say, a clinical depressive episode. And then that you are able to work through your changing relationship with what you have to do in terms of responding to the fact that something changed or you lost something, right? And then the thing that's most related to like acceptance in the old model is that you kind of rework your life so that you are adjusting to a life that is the life that exists after the change or the loss, right? And so you're kind of renegotiating your relationship with the thing that was part of your history now, the life that was prior to the change or the loss, and you're adjusting to, okay, so this is what life is like after that change or loss has occurred. So all of that is basically Grief 101 when we're talking about more straightforward grief, and we're not talking about complicated grief. But unfortunately, for a lot of people with a lot of types of changes, that grief can be complicated. So sometimes the change or the loss is not happening in a way that optimally facilitates the ability to accomplish the tasks of grief, right? And in the cases of sufferers of chronic pain, this is often true because while someone may have chronic pain after a very significant change, let's say someone had a life-altering injury in an automobile accident, and part of the consequences of that is chronic pain. The ability to move around in the world prior to the accident compared to after the accident might be relatively straightforward in terms of the types of limitations of activities caused by the injuries and then the chronic health condition as a result of the accident. But the chronic pain might not be stable, right? So it might have had an onset at the time of the accident, but even though the changes and limitations might have occurred at one specific point in time, therefore you can kind of relate to that as a change that is kind of situated in your timeline. The way that the chronic pain manifests for lots of people does not really situate itself in a neat and tidy way in time so that you can, adjust to situation A prior to the pain, situation B after the pain. Let me give you another example. Let's say you have someone who has a health condition that has episodic flare-ups that are painful, something like an autoimmune issue like lupus or ulcerative colitis. So their life might be characterized by periods of remission where they have a low level of symptoms or no symptoms and less medications and no real pain. And then they have flare-ups where they have these episodes that are acute of varying lengths, and they have more debilitation, more pain, more need to get evaluation and treatment and medications, and less certainty during those episodes about whether it's going to get more severe, right? So, someone who's living with a chronic condition that has episodic flare-ups like that isn't going to be able to have the tasks of the grief process happen in the same way because you're dealing with ambiguity. Ambiguity is the main reason that people have complicated grief. If you look at someone who's having a more complicated grief process, often somewhere in there is the aspect of ambiguity. And ambiguity means it prevents us from being able, again, to relate to life prior to the change, life after the change. Because what is life after the change, Another example would be someone with chronic pain from some sort of health condition who's going through a really protracted, months-long, maybe even years-long process of lots of different types of evaluations to try to figure out what the heck they're dealing with. So how do you adjust to something if you don't even know what you're adjusting to? You don't know what to expect. If you have something that's very neat and tidy, you can adjust to it, but someone might have a lot of pain and it's a condition that they know is serious enough to cause the pain, but maybe they've been to 14 different doctors and nobody's given them a good answer about A, what it is, and B, how to treat it. So they don't know what to expect. And maybe it's fluctuating in severity and relative level of debilitation and limitation on their life, right? So, so chronic pain causes grief because it is something to which we have to adjust, and often parts of the adjustment are the limitations that come along as secondary issues with the chronic health condition and the chronic pain, and limitations in activities and sense of self-worth, relationships, work, things that are meaningful. And chronic pain often is getting in the way of sleep and exercise. And when sleep and exercise go down, our general wellness profile gets more brittle, right? It's harder to take care of ourselves when we're not sleeping well, and it's a chronic sleep deprivation situation. And when maybe we're physically limited so that we can't move around in the world and get some adequate exercise, because exercise is so beneficial for our mental health and emotional health, right? So these are some of the ways that chronic pain then induces a complicated grief process, because it is strong enough in terms of a set of stimuli to trigger the grief process, but often there are aspects of ambiguity in terms of just what am I adjusting to? What can I expect tomorrow, right? I was a sufferer for over 2 decades of a chronic health condition in my life, which was very random and fluctuating. It was there more often than not, but it wasn't there all the time. And when it would flare up, I didn't know how long it would be flared up or how severe the flare up would be, and so when I had the experience of the onset of a flare up of my health condition, how do I react to that? Because I don't know, is it going to last 4 hours or 2 months, right? And what is it going to mean in terms of me having to adjust my medications, and how severe is it going to get, right? Am I going to have to call in sick to work? Am I going to get hospitalized? Like, how severe is this going to be, right? All of that ambiguity meant there was no neat and tidy thing to which I was reacting. There certainly was a thing I was reacting to, but there wasn't a thing I could react to and work through, because the thing itself, the flare-up, wasn't stable and well-defined and one that I could know in terms of, okay, here are all the contours of that, here are all the features of that, therefore I can react to that, right? Again, grief is miserable when it's uncomplicated, but it's so much more challenging when it is complicated, right? So these are some of the ways that grief is complicated in the situation of suffering chronic pain, okay? Now, on this channel, I do address the issue of chronic stress, and have already in some videos, and I will continue to do so because I think it's such an important issue. You can check out, for example, the video, The 3 Types of Stress, where I talk about acute, medium, and chronic stress. I'll put a link to that up here now. But chronic stress is debilitating because it wears us out. Chronic stress and chronic grief processes go on longer than we want them to, and because they go on so long, they start to cause a psychological fatigue, which then compounds the stress, because we have stress times time, which is stress loading. That's the equation. But when we start to get worn out by the chronic stress, then fatigue sets in, and that makes the stress loading multiplied by the fatigue factor. So we have stress times time times fatigue, which is why chronic stress is so much more of an issue in terms of it being impactful on our lives, because it causes so much more stress loading. So one way to deal with the chronic aspect of the chronic stress of complicated grief from chronic pain is to schedule time to grieve, because chronic stress is stressful because it's unremitting. It stretches all the way out to the horizon. We can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But we really, really need to take mental breaks in order to get some mental recovery to reduce that fatigue factor. So one tip I would give you if you are dealing with chronic complicated grief related to anything, including chronic pain, is schedule a time to grieve. So, for example, if you're watching this video right now, you might say, okay, later this afternoon, I'm going to schedule 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm just literally going to let myself grieve, okay? And I'll do that at 4 o'clock because that's a time when I'm likely to have space in my day where I don't have to focus on something else. So 4 o'clock comes around, you literally sit down and say, I'm going to feel what I feel about this situation. I'm going to let myself think the thoughts that I'm thinking about this situation, even if they're negative thoughts. And I'm just going to kind of let that go in an unfiltered way. I'm going to notice them. I'm not going to get too fused with them, and take the mental ball and run with it. But I'm going to notice all the things I'm feeling and thinking about this, and I'm going to do it for like 10 minutes. At the end of the 10 minutes, then you stop it. You do something distracting. Go do something that's mentally engaging enough to let you unhook from the 10-minute period where you let yourself grieve in an unfiltered way, right? This is an important thing to be able to literally get out of the 10 minutes, to not just fall into the 10 minutes of grieving and then not get back out and do all day of grieving, right? That's the point of the exercise. So do something distracting. If you have trouble making the transition from the 10-minute grieving to the distraction thing, whatever you're doing next, you have to do something mentally engaging enough that it unhooks your brain. So like count backwards from 25 to 0 very slowly out loud. That's one way to do that, right? So I hope you like the content on this channel. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you like the channel, feel very free to subscribe, and feel very free to leave comments below, because those help me learn what types of things that people would like to see on the channel. And if you have a friend or loved one that you think might benefit from this video, feel very free to share it with them. And I will see you in an upcoming video.